So I bought my first modern Rolex. Okay, so apparently I have a type. This is my Grand Seiko SLGA013. I like these dress watches a lot, but specifically I like these dressy, sporty, everyday wear to, like, you know, wherever you like kind of watches. Ones that I don't have to baby, but also just wow. I've always been a self-proclaimed Grand Seiko fanboy, and to me, they make watches that are as good, if not better, than their Swiss counterparts. I don't like 80 games, and watch brands that allow you to just come in and buy a watch. I feel like they're the ones who really appreciate your business, right? But still, there's something about Rolex that makes me want one. Whether it's the marketing that got me like at a subconscious level, like some kind of hypnosis, or maybe it's the timeless design. I don't know, but I still want one, and it's not like I'm not going to admit that. I still want one in my collection. And so in comes the Rolex Datejust. So this is essentially a comparison video between these two watches, and in a way they're going to be pseudo reviews for both of these watches. I'm going to go into detail about both watches, and hey, I may end up making individual reviews for each of them, but as of right now, you know, this is the video I wanted to make, and I wanted to see, you know, the difference between a $10,000 Grand Seiko and how it stacks up to a $14,000-15,000 Rolex. Firstly, I'd like to start with the most obvious difference, the difference in material. The Rolex Datejust, this one specifically, is a two-tone Datejust, meaning that there's two different materials that this watch is made out of. That in itself is, you know, always on debate. Whether or not two-tone itself is a thing of the past for older men, or if it's still something that can be appreciated. And to me, I love the two-toned Ever Rose gold versions. I'm not a huge fan of just Rolex's regular gold, but Ever Rose, to me, yeah, they got it right. So Rolex uses a 904L steel, which is highly corrosion resistant. They claim that even with exposure to salt water or the sea, you won't need to rinse it off to keep it from corroding, because that's how corrosion resistant it is. But I think what's really special about Rolex's proprietary metals is their precious Ever Rose gold. And that is because the Ever Rose gold is essentially an alloy It is an alloy of gold, obviously, and copper for the redness that makes it rose gold. However, due to the properties of copper, which oxidizes over time, rose gold tends to fade and become more and more like yellow gold over time. Not instantaneously, obviously, but over long periods of time it can. So Rolex added a high percentage of platinum to this metal in order to keep it from oxidizing, and it allows the alloy to stay this color essentially forever, or as long as they think it can. Grand Seiko, on the other hand, uses their proprietary, the amount of times I'm going to say proprietary in this video is going to be ridiculous, ever brilliant steel. To me, this steel definitely looks whiter, at least paler than regular steel does. Not sure if it fully justifies it in the video. Even aside from the Zaratsu polishing, this watch is really, really shiny. Almost makes it look like some kind of precious metal. Not white gold, because white gold tends to have a yellow hue. This has just a brighter, whiter hue. Now, Grand Seiko's Ever Brilliant Steel is also super corrosion resistant. In fact, it is actually more corrosion resistant than the Rolex 904L steel. Grand Seiko claims to have 1.7 times the brand value of 316L steel. 316L steel is around 27.1. So even then, even with the average of 25, let's say, 1.7 times that is 42.5. Rolex's Oyster steel, which is 904L steel, is around 36.7. So it is definitely a greater achievement in itself. Obviously, material-wise though, if you're talking about that $5,000 difference, I don't know if that rose gold, if that amount of rose gold is enough to justify $5,000. But I mean, who's the idiot here? I'm the one who spent that money, so I feel like watches, it's never a logical thing, or at least we try to keep it as logical as we can, but at the end of the day, the heart wants what the heart wants, and apparently my heart wanted both of these. I'm not quite sure my wallet agrees with me, but unluckily, for my wallet at least, I'm the one in control. So I talked about how the Grand Seiko Ever Brilliant steel has a wider kind of hue to it. Well, the Rolex's rose gold actually kind of changes in color too, or at least the hue changes a bit depending on the lighting. Sometimes it's more of a pinkish gold, and at others it's more yellow-like. And I wonder if that's due to the polishing and how it reflects lighting. And I think for both of these watches, the stock photos don't do it justice at all. And I think that's something that watch companies could definitely improve on, is their stock photos, their marketing photos. Their rose gold does not look like the rose gold on their stock photos. And this watch doesn't look anything like their stock photos. Let's start talking about the dials. The Grand Seiko dial is definitely the more subdued one. It's the one for the watch nerds where it begs to have us look closer at the details, very much a Grand Seiko style dial. In ordinary lighting, it looks more like a black dial, a plain black dial. But that in itself is good because it gives the Zaratsu polishing its own time to shine. It also lends it another dimension. It definitely makes that Zaratsu polishing pop out. But once the light hits this thing, this whole watch sparkles and dances, showing all its flares. The dial pops out, the ever brilliant steel starts becoming really, really shiny, and Grand Seiko dials are always inspired by nature. One day I would really like to just stand outside their studio and see if all of these nature that they're taking from is really as pretty as their watches. This one specifically is inspired by the night sky, the stars basically. To me, this one reminds me more of their wooden pattern dial, but they just kind of flipped it to it on a different angle. How Grand Seiko makes their dials is, to quote Grand Seiko, firstly, they cut out the round brass pieces for the dial base. Then they stamp each one with a metal mold. So each mold, I assume, would have intricate designed patterns on them. So when it stamps it, it makes a perfect replica, or I guess inverse, of their design. So, it actually is etched into the dial. It is actually pressed into the dial. You can actually see the textures and they actually exist. It's not just printed on. They actually exist. Rolex, on the other hand, the way Rolex does their motif dials is first they have a sunburst brushed finished dial, which is very apparent when I turn it around in the lighting. Although I do wish that their sunburst dial was cleaner. To me, it does seem a bit rough. I'm not sure how I can describe this, but the texturing of the sunburst effect itself seems a bit rough. That aside, they make the motif dials by having a femtosecond laser. Essentially, this etches the surface of the dial super precisely and selectively, according to watchpalace.com, to produce patterns that only a few tenths of a micrometer deep to create this kind of design. And so even though it does remove a little bit of the material, it's only very, very slight. So definitely a different approach from Grand Seiko. And to me, this dial screams more of a, hey, look at me kind of dial, where you see this design from miles away. You can see this design all the time, whether or not the lighting is good or not. And I actually welcome that change. It is nice to have a watch where that intricate dial design is always something that you can appreciate. I mean, both are great for different people. Or why not have both? I'm not gonna lie, on a quick glance though, the Rolex style does kind of remind me of the teak deck of an Omega Aquaterra. So at a quick glance, it almost reminds me of the Omega's two-tone Sedna Aquaterra. And because of the way that this dial stands out so much, I do prefer the smooth bezel and the regular oyster bracelet to pair with this dial. And hey, that's just my opinion. Don't bring out the pitchforks. At least not yet. Because hey, I almost forgot to go through the case dimensions. The Grand Seiko SLGA 013 has a case diameter of 40 millimeters, lug to lug of 47.4 millimeters, thickness of 12.1 millimeters, and the lug width of 19 millimeters. It's a 44GS case, so it wears really, really well. 12.1 millimeters to me is a pretty nicely proportioned thickness. It's not the thinnest watch out there, but it's definitely not bad, especially for a spring drive automatic movement. The Rolex Datejust 41 has a 41 millimeter diameter, 12 millimeter thickness, and a 47.5 millimeters lug to lug. So dimensions wise, actually very, very similar to the Grand Seiko. The lug width is 21 millimeters. So that's right, I have a 21 millimeter lug width watch now, and a 19 millimeter lug width watch. And that's just gonna make finding a strap that much harder. I mean, I guess it's not that much harder to find the strap. It's more of, now I'm going to have a bunch of 19 millimeter straps and a bunch of 21 millimeter straps exclusively for these two watches. Whereas usually if you have things that are more common, like even number lug widths, 20 millimeters, then you can swap those straps between your watches and use them however you like. At least the Grand Seiko has drilled lugs though, whereas the Rolex does not. Speaking of K-shape and dial, it's nice to have a clean, crisp lume. Rolex uses their proprietary lume. It's super bright, it's really nice, very crisp. I do miss it sometime. There is no lume on the second hand, which I guess is a design choice to make the Datejust more dressy. Makes sense. The thing is though, the amazing Zaratsu polishing on the indices on the Grand Seiko, you can still see it in the dark. Well, at least if there's any little minuscule amount of lighting. But you do need that little bit of light. So in complete darkness, you aren't able to see anything, while the Rolex you definitely can. And just personally going from the Grand Seiko to the Rolex, it is nice to have that lume. And I understand that for a dress watch, lume isn't exactly necessary. But I think it's done tastefully and minimally. So it's done really well and it doesn't really ruin the aesthetic. And it's just overall nice to have. I do have to say though, that the finishing on the indices and the hands on the Grand Seiko, second to none. It's a masterclass. Just look at all the angles and facets that are on the specific hands and indices. They have to be able to polish all of that to create this three-dimensional effect. If you look at the hands itself, it comes to a sharp point, very sword-like. Rolex does a good job and it's very clean, but as you can see, there's not many beveling. It's pretty plain stick hands. Now right above the indices for the Datejusts are printed Arabic numerals. It tells you the corresponding minutes. It has an okay legibility, not super legible or illegible due to the dial pattern mainly, but It's still nice to have, and it seems more like a design choice, to be honest, to fill the 41mm dial better so it doesn't look just like empty spacing. Again, like I was saying, the large smooth bezel just provides a clean look. I think it's still flashy considering the polishing and how large that bezel is. And it's just part of that Rolex Oyster case DNA. The case itself does not have as many facets and angles compared to the Grand Seiko, so that allows a large bezel and dial to demand the attention. Again, just in my opinion, smooth bezel just works like a perfect combo for the motif dials. Here's the Rolex Hot around the dial and the infamous Cyclops magnifier. I don't actually mind the magnifier date window. I know a lot of people don't like it because of the symmetry or the way it looks, but you know, I think it's just part of the Rolex aesthetic. I don't really mind it. It also just means that they have to make that date window that much cleaner because it's under magnifying pretty much 24/7. And that means Rolex has to be pretty ballsy for that. And we were already getting here, but let's talk about that polishing on the lugs and bezels. Grand Seiko has a mixture of Zaratsu and brushed polishing throughout the whole case, meaning that Grand Seiko's finishing is definitely done more intricately and with more care. Consider the fact that this 44GS case has many angles and facets. Getting the Zaratsu polish where you want, it sure takes a lot of skill. Zaratsu polishing is done by hand by workers that apply a specific amount of pressure for a specific amount of time against a specific part of a polishing wheel, which takes years to learn. Something that also isn't commonly mentioned is that even the hairline finish is done by pressing and sliding the case across a metal plate covered with 400 to 800 grit sandpaper. So the finishing is time consuming and done one case at a time rather than mass machine compared to Rolex. It's really hard to show and compare the difference between Zaratsu and regular polishing, but under specific lighting, it shows extremely clearly. It's also just the fact that in general, the finishing of the Grand Seiko is immaculate compared to other brands. Let's address the elephant in the room. The bracelets. Grand Seiko is known to have just okay bracelets where there is no micro adjust on the clasp and they just provide half links. To me, however, because the half links on the Grand Seiko is not truly a half link, it's more like a 3/4 link, you're still able to finagle it in a way where you get a really comfortable sizing. The only thing that Grand Seiko doesn't have that I would really like them to get is on the fly adjustment, because wrists do change throughout the day, and that does affect comfort level. However, the bracelet on the Grand Seiko is very, very smooth, very comfortable, almost feels like pebbles. You know, like the smooth pebbles. Whereas the Rolex, the bracelet is really nice and it does taper down, which I actually find very, very sexy. I love that the Rolex bracelet does taper. And I also love that there is at least polished center links versus the brushed side links. I think that contrast does provide an interesting look. My issue with the Rolex bracelet is, well, that large polished center link is a scratch magnet. On top of that, the amount of finishing is, while it's clean, it's not superb by any means. And at the same time, all of these edges right here on this corner feels extremely sharp. It's the same issue that I had with my Tudor bracelet. It just feels sharp. The really cool thing is the Rolex does have on the fly adjustments where you can put half a link in there and pop it back out. This is great because I do get to use this a lot throughout the day, and that makes it so that my wrist is pretty much always comfortable. Another thing that I love about the Rolex bracelet is that there is, on top of the on the fly adjustment, there is micro adjust on the bracelet. Although the Rolex bracelet technically doesn't have half links, so for me, if you're not going to go with half links, you have to have on the fly adjustment. So that kind of balances out. The other thing I do wish that Grand Seiko had is a more tapered bracelet. You can see this is practically no taper, and it just loses a bit of elegance. Although their finishing is a lot more interesting, once again, where you go from brushed to polished to brushed to polished to brushed. I think that makes for a very beautiful contrast, very Grand Seiko-esque. And I think there's one more thing that is very interesting that people don't really talk about, is I wish people talked about the thickness of the bracelet. I mean, I know it's not that big of a difference, but it does feel like there is something going on. Because even when you drop it like this, and they both jut out, right? They both don't have female bracelets. And extends lug to lug. The Rolex does feel like it demands more attention. It does feel thicker, possibly because of the way the bracelet is. And this isn't Grand Seiko's fault, but I just wanted to make a note here. I absolutely love the rose gold and the Rolex proprietary steel contrast on that bracelet. It's just kind of a very interesting contemporary look to it. Another thing that I wanted to note was that for some reason the Rolex bracelet, it catches my almost non-existent arm hair. I don't have much arm hair, if at all, and it somehow still manages to catch it, whereas the Grand Seiko's does not. I wonder if it's just due to the sharpness of the Rolex bracelet, but this also hasn't really happened with my Tudor bracelet either. So for some odd reason, the Rolex bracelet is just catching my non-existent or almost non-existent arm hair. Another thing I wanted to note was that for Rolex, the back of the bracelet isn't really polished the same way. It actually did a full brushed finishing. I wonder if that's just Rolex's way of cutting costs, or if they feel like it's more comfortable that way. But Grand Seiko, they do the finishing for the front and the back. Again, attention to detail. Funny enough, due to that ever brilliant steel though, and that polishing, someone has asked me before if this was a Rolex. And I wonder if this is how people feel like Rolex is supposed to look like. Let's move on to the movements. The Rolex has a superlative chronometer, +2 -2 seconds per day, after casing, versus the spring drive, the +-10 seconds per month, which is 0.33 per day. And they're quoting it at +-0.5 seconds per day, but that's still extremely impressive. But the Rolex does have that insta-date change, and I always love that. You can see the ticks for the Rolex, even though it's a high beat movement, 28,800 beats per hour, or around 8 beats per second, but you can see it beating. This is supposed to help with accuracy, having a high beat movement, and while the challenge is having an equally high power reserve, Rolex is able to make it around 70 hours. While Grand Seiko, because of the spring drive movement, has that pure, smooth glide. Absolutely no ticking. think a really big difference, for me at least, is that finishing and that see-through case back. It's absolutely beautiful. They have to do a skeletonized rotor so that you can actually see this case back. Grand Seiko has a 5-day power reserve, which is 128 hours, by using a dual-sized barrel versus Rolex's 70. Grand Seiko's power reserve on the back, even that is finished beautifully. They claim that the finishing they use on the back is kind of this like frost inspired finishing, and I do kind of see it. Grand Seiko has 38 jewels, while Rolex's movement has 31 jewels, which is, you know, a contrast. It's pretty negligible to me, but some people may care. The amount of jewels that they use is mainly because of trying to reduce the amount of friction that their movement has to go through. Now, Rolex has their Parachrome blue hairspring, which is their own alloy for their hairspring to make it 10 times more shock resistant and resistant to magnetic fields and temperature changes. I wish we could see it though. It would be very cool to see that blue hairspring doing its job. Rolex also has Paraflex shock absorbers to make it even more shock resistant versus Grand Seiko's electromagnetic system, which is controlled by a quartz crystal grown and selected by Grand Seiko themselves. It slows the energy from the mainspring with no friction, hence the smooth glide, to get that super accurate movement. Grand Seiko also has an offset magic lever, is what they call it. In general though, it essentially increases efficiency, or how much easier it is to recharge the watch. And what it does is, this is Grand Seiko's, or Seiko's actually, invention, where no matter which direction the watch is oscillating, it will still wind the mainspring, which is the thing that powers the watch, in the same direction. They made an offset one for this movement to maintain the thinness and improve efficiency, and lowers the wear to the system. They also have a one-piece center bridge, which combines the barrel bridge, center wheel, bridge, and winding stem into one center pillar instead of having them separate like normally, which gives this more durability and shock resistance. I mean, honestly, you can't really compete with the spring drive accuracy, but for a purely mechanical, no quartz crystal, this is probably still one of the best movements. For all the people who care about the noise that their watch makes, this Rolex, if you put it next to your ear, you're still going to hear that high beat. If you put the Grand Seiko next to your ear, you're not going to hear anything because there is no beating. However, that Rolex, I don't know how they do it, but you will not feel the rotor on this thing. The Grand Seiko, while it's not bad, you can still feel the rotor shift a little bit. That's all I had for today. Really appreciate it if you stuck throughout the whole video. I know it was a long one. I just wanted to get all my thoughts out there. Hope you liked it. Please like and subscribe. Maybe leave a comment.